give us the verse, and then should it be in or should it be out?
It's impossible to know even what it means to speak of an original. And 2 Corinthians is not the only problem. The book of Acts in the New Testament, the 5th book of the New Testament, appears in 2 different forms in our manuscripts. 2 major forms of the text. One form of the text of the book of Acts is 8.5% longer than the other. Many scholars think that whoever wrote Acts, call him Luke, published 2 editions of the work. A shorter one and a longer one that he later edited. If so, what is the original? The shorter or the longer? The Gospel of John. Scholars have long recognized that the epilogue found in John chapter 21, where Jesus has several resurrection appearances before his disciples, was not originally part of the Gospel of John, but was tacked on later. It wasn't originally there. Again, this is just a common view among New Testament scholars throughout Europe and North America. But all of our manuscripts have it. So what is the original text of John? Is it with 21 or without 21? And what about the prologue of John? That very famous passage, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This passage, the prologue of John, has numerous themes found nowhere else in the Gospel of John, and the writing style is radically different from everywhere else in the Gospel of John, so that many scholars think chapters 1, verses 1 through 18, were added to John after it had originally been published. Yet all the manuscripts have it. So which is the original text? The Gospel of Luke. Luke begins with the story of Jesus' virgin birth in Bethlehem, chapters 1 and 2. But scholars have long recognized that chapter 3 looks like the original beginning of the book, that it didn't originally have chapters 1 and 2. But the manuscripts all have chapters 1 and 2. So what is the original text? If it was originally published without chapters 1 and 2, shouldn't we begin our Bibles with Luke chapter 3? Or the Gospel of Mark. Mark's gospel ends with the women going to the tomb after Jesus has been raised from the dead, seeing a man there who tells them that they're to go to Galilee, tell the disciples to go to Galilee, where Jesus will meet them. But the women flee from the tomb, and they don't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. End of gospel. Many scholars think that the gospel ends too abruptly. You can't end a gospel without Jesus showing up to the disciples after the resurrection, and many scholars think that a page has been lost. If a page has been lost from the end of the gospel, what's the original gospel? If it's the gospel with the original page, we don't have any access to it. If you say it's the gospel without the original page, then you're saying a later form of the gospel is the original gospel, and that hardly makes sense. And so we have it. A problem with the original. How do we know what the original is? Does it make sense even to talk about the original? This is the theoretical problem we have in even mentioning the original. So that's problem 1. What does the original text even mean? Problem 2, where are the early manuscripts of the New Testament? Let me say something about the surviving copies of the New Testament. Today we have some 5,500 copies of the New Testament. By last week, the official count was 5,560 manuscripts that had been cataloged of the Greek New Testament. The New Testament was originally written in Greek. That is far more than for any other book in the ancient world. Far more than any other, way more than any book of Homer, or of Plato, or Aeschylus, or Sophocles, or Euripides, or pick your author. We have far, far more manuscripts of the New Testament than any other book in the ancient world, by a long shot. So just take that as a given. And the reason's obvious, because the people copying books in the Middle Ages were monks in monasteries. They're the ones who gave us our surviving books. And which books were they interested in? Were they principally interested in Aeschylus or Plato? Or not principally, they're principally interested in the Bible. So they copied the Bible. That's why we have thousands of these manuscripts. The problem is not the number of manuscripts or the fact that we have more than for any other author of antiquity. The problem is the ages of these manuscripts. How many manuscripts of the New Testament do we have from the first Christian century? None. From the decades after the books were written, how many do we have? The years afterwards, the decade, none. 0. How many do we have from the early 2nd century? Say, manuscripts that clearly date up to around the year 150. We have one scrap. This is it. This may look big because it's a big screen. This is the actual size. It's the size of a credit card. It's written on both front and back. It's from John chapter 18. It has several verses on it. You can see this little scrap has parts of 7 lines on it. It's a very important manuscript because it's the earliest one we have. It's the early 2nd century, and it is the only manuscript we have from the early 2nd century. That's it. How many complete manuscripts do we have from the 2nd and 3rd centuries? We're not just talking about decades now after these things were originally written and copied and mistakes made and mistakes replicated and then more mistakes made and more replicated. We're not talking about years or decades. We're talking about centuries. How many complete manuscripts do we have from the 2nd and 3rd centuries? None. 0. Well, if we have 5,500 manuscripts, where are they from? When are they from? Well, 94% of our surviving manuscripts come from the 9th century and later. 94% come from the 9th century, which is great if you want to know what the Bible looked like when Christians were reading it in the year 890. But if you want to know how they were reading it in the year 70, you've got a problem, because you don't have manuscripts from that period. If you wanted to make a stack of the Bibles that are available to scholars today in manuscript form, the stack would go up to the ceiling. If you want to make a stack of the manuscripts that were made within, say, 60 or 80 years of the production of these books, you wouldn't be able to see the stack if we put it on the stage, because there's hardly anything. Let me say a few more things about the surviving copies of the New Testament and point out some of the problems we have with the surviving manuscripts. First, number of mistakes. I've told you that when scribes copy manuscripts, they make mistakes. And maybe you're thinking, yeah, well, says you. Is there like evidence of this, or is this just one of your other crazy opinions? Well, again, it is one of my crazy opinions, but there turns out to be evidence. We have 5,500 manuscripts of the New Testament. It is striking that when you compare these with one another in detail, no 2 of them are exactly alike in their wording. They all differ. Why do they differ? Because people are changing the text. Well, how many differences are there exactly? So, scholars have wondered about this for over 300 years. In the year 1707, there was a famous scholar named John Mill, who was an Oxford scholar, not related to John Stuart Mill, whom you may have heard of before. This is a different John Mill. John Mill spent 30 years of his life studying the manuscripts available to him. He had about 100 Greek manuscripts that he could examine. And he had the quotations of the New Testament in the ancient translations of the New Testament into Coptic and Syriac and Latin and so forth. And he had some quotations of the New Testament in the writings of the Church Fathers. And he had a bunch of evidence. And he looked at this evidence. And in 1707, after 30 years of labor, he published a book called the Novum Testamentum Graeci, the Greek New Testament. In this book, he gave a few lines of the text of the New Testament, and then below it indicated places where the manuscripts he looked at differed from one another. So this was an apparatus of readings. The apparatus showed where the manuscripts differed from one another. To the shock and dismay of many readers, John Mill's Novum Testamentum Graeci, in the apparatus, he indicated 30,000 places of difference among the manuscripts that he had examined. 30,000 places where the manuscripts differed from one another. And he was looking at 100 manuscripts. We have 5,500 manuscripts today. Well, how many differences are there among these manuscripts exactly? No one knows, because no one's been able to count them all. Some scholars say 200,000 differences. Some say 300,000 differences. Probably more accurately, 400,000 differences. It's easiest to put it in comparative terms. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament.